The temperature inside Gunnar Holmgren's shelter held steady at 52 degrees, while the blizzard outside dropped to 30 below zero, and when Joseph Weaver stumbled through waist-deep snow, searching desperately for any structure that might save his life, he walked directly over the hidden entrance 3 times before finally spotting the thin ribbon of smoke rising from what appeared to be nothing but a snow-covered hillside. What Gunnar had built 18 months earlier would become the only reason 6 men survived the storm of '58. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The roof beam cracked with a sound like a rifle shot at 2 in the morning on November 7, 1856. Gunnar Holmgren woke to that sound and had perhaps 3 seconds to understand what was happening before the entire western half of the Turries' cabin's roof collapsed inward under the weight of wet, heavy snow. He rolled from his sleeping platform instinctively, hitting the dirt floor as timber and debris crashed down where he had been lying moments before. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Dust and snow filled the cabin's interior, making it impossible to see or breathe properly. Owen Daniels had been sleeping on the opposite side of the cabin, directly beneath the section that failed. Gunnar heard him cry out once, then nothing. The cabin went silent except for the sound of settling debris and wind howling through the new opening in the roof. Gunnar tried to move and realized he was pinned from the waist down by a roof timber that had fallen across his legs. The weight was substantial but not crushing. He could feel his legs and wiggle his toes, which meant no major bones were broken. But he could not free himself. He called Owen's name 3 times, no response. The temperature inside the cabin, which had been tolerably warm from the fire they had banked before sleep, began dropping immediately. Cold air poured through the collapsed roof section. Snow continued falling, accumulating on the debris and on Gunnar's chest and face. He tried again to shift the timber, pinning him, bracing his hands against the ground, and pushing. The beam moved slightly, but not enough. Without leverage, he could not generate sufficient force to free himself. Hours passed. Gunnar could not see Owen's position through the darkness and debris. He called out periodically, hoping for response, hearing nothing. As dawn light began filtering through the broken roof, he could finally assess the situation. The main ridgepole had snapped near its center point, allowing the entire western roof section to pancake downward. Owen was buried under at least 3 feet of timber, bark roofing material, and snow. Gunnar could see one of his partner's arms extending from beneath the debris, motionless. The temperature continued, dropping as morning advanced. Gunnar's legs were growing numb from cold and restricted circulation. He attempted again to free himself, this time using a piece of broken roof timber as a lever. After 20 minutes of effort, he managed to shift the main beam enough to pull his legs free. He crawled across the debris field to where Owen lay buried and began removing timber and snow with hands that were rapidly losing feeling. It took an hour to uncover Owen's body. His partner had been killed almost instantly. The main ridgepole had struck him across the chest and neck. Death would have been quick, which was the only mercy in the situation. Gunnar sat beside the body as full daylight arrived, snow still falling through the open roof, and tried to process what had happened. They had built this cabin the previous summer using techniques every mountain man knew. Notched corners, standard log construction, pole and bark roof. It had seemed solid. It should have been adequate. But adequate had not been enough. Gunnar buried Owen Daniels on November 9, 1856, on a ridge overlooking the creek where they had run their trap lines together for 2 seasons. The ground was already freezing, making the work brutal. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night in what remained of the collapsed cabin, unable to sleep, staring at the broken roof timbers illuminated by firelight. Something had shifted in his understanding of survival. For 6 years, he had lived in the mountains using methods every trapper knew. Build a cabin with notched logs, cover it with poles and bark, chink the gaps with mud and moss, and accept that winter would be hard but survivable. Owen's death proved that acceptance was not enough. The cabin had been built correctly by frontier standards, yet it had failed under conditions that were not even exceptional. The November storm had been heavy but not unprecedented. Gunnar began observing things he had previously ignored. A week after Owen's burial, he found a bear den while checking trap lines. The entrance was a narrow opening in a hillside, barely visible beneath an overhang of roots and earth. He approached carefully, confirming the den was empty, then examined its construction. The bear had excavated back into the slope, creating a chamber perhaps 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. Inside, even with outside temperatures well below freezing, the air was noticeably warmer. The earth itself provided insulation. He found badger holes that showed the same principle. Animals that denned underground for winter were using the earth as protection, not fighting against it with structures built on top of the ground. The concept seemed obvious once he noticed it, but it contradicted everything frontier construction taught. Cabins were built above ground because that was how buildings were made. Gunnar remembered his grandfather's stories from Norway. The old man had described turf houses built into hillsides, structures where the roof was covered with living sod and the walls were partially underground. His grandfather had described them as warm in winter, cool in summer, and nearly invisible from a distance. Gunnar had heard those stories as a child and thought nothing of them. Now, sitting in a half-destroyed cabin with winter closing in, those memories took on new significance. He spent the remainder of November and all of December studying failed structures in the region. He visited abandoned cabins and found consistent patterns. Roofs collapsed under snow load because pole construction could not support sufficient weight. Corners separated because notched logs shifted under stress. Walls leaked heat because gaps between logs were inevitable. Every cabin he examined was fighting the environment, trying to keep nature out through barriers that were never quite adequate. By January, Gunnar had reached a conclusion that seemed radical but was supported by everything he had observed. The solution was not to build a better cabin above ground. The solution was to build into the ground itself, using the earth as structure and insulation. When spring came, he would build something different. Something hidden and underground, something that would not collapse and kill him. Spring arrived late in 1857. Gunnar spent April completing his trapline work and selling furs at the trading post on the Yellowstone River. He returned to the mountains in early May with unusual supplies. Most trappers bought powder, lead, coffee, and basic goods. Gunnar purchased 2 quality shovels, a pickaxe, iron bars for prying rocks, and 60 feet of rope. The trading post clerk asked what he was planning to build. Gunnar said he was digging a root cellar. The clerk accepted this explanation without question. He selected his building site with deliberate care. The location was a south-facing hillside, half a mile from the creek where he and Owen had trapped. The slope was gentle, enough to excavate, but steep enough to provide natural drainage. The soil was a mixture of clay and rock, difficult to dig but stable once exposed. Massive pine trees grew above the site, their roots helping to anchor the hillside. Below the site, the ground sloped away, ensuring water would run downhill rather than into his excavation. Gunnar began digging on May 15th. The work was immediately brutal. He started by outlining the structure's footprint, a rectangle 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep running back into the hillside. He removed the surface layer of sod carefully, cutting it into blocks he could reuse later. Beneath the sod lay 18 inches of topsoil, mixed with roots and rocks. Beneath that, dense clay packed with stones. He dug from dawn until exhaustion forced him to stop, sleeping in a temporary shelter built from pine boughs. Each day he removed approximately 6 wheelbarrow loads of earth, using a wooden barrow he constructed from materials salvaged from the collapsed cabin. The dirt pile grew behind him as the excavation slowly deepened. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached constantly. Progress was measured in inches. Nathaniel Pierce and Ezra Thornton visited in early June. They were partners working trap lines 10 miles north. They stood at the edge of Gunnar's excavation and stared in obvious confusion. "What exactly are you building?" Nathaniel asked. "A winter shelter," Gunnar said, not stopping his work. "Underground?" Ezra's tone made clear what he thought of the idea. into the hillside, using the earth for insulation and protection. The two men exchanged glances. "You're digging your own grave," Nathaniel said. "That hole will fill with water, first heavy rain, or collapse on you while you sleep." "I'm engineering drainage and proper shoring," Gunnar replied. "You're wasting your summer," Ezra said. "Could build a proper cabin in 4 days. You've been digging 3 weeks and got nothing but a hole." They left, shaking their heads. Gunnar continued digging. Martin Graves arrived in late June. He was older than most trappers, perhaps 55, with gray in his beard and a thoughtful manner. He watched Gunnar work for 20 minutes before speaking. "Reminds me of sod houses I saw in Kansas," Martin said. "Settlers building into the ground because timber was scarce." "Were they warm?" Gunnar asked. "Warmest structures I ever entered on the plains. Cool in summer, too." Martin stayed for an hour, asking questions about Gunnar's plans for roof support and waterproofing. He did not mock. When he left, he said he would return to see the finished structure. Gunnar believed him. By mid-July, Gunnar's excavation reached its planned depth of 8 feet at the rear wall, sloping upward to 4 feet at the entrance. The chamber measured 12 feet wide and 16 feet from front to back. Now came the critical work of preventing collapse and water infiltration. He began with drainage, digging a trench along the outside perimeter of the excavation, angling it downslope. The trench would intercept groundwater before it reached the shelter walls, channeling it away from the structure. He lined the drainage trench with rocks, creating a crude but effective French drain system. Water flowing through soil would hit the rock-filled trench and follow it downhill rather than seeping into his living space. The technique required 2 weeks of additional digging and rock gathering, but Gunnar understood that managing water was essential. An underground shelter that flooded was worse than useless. For the walls, he gathered river rock from the creek below. Each stone was selected for size and shape, prioritizing flat surfaces that would stack with minimal gaps. He built retaining walls along both sides of the excavation and across the front face, leaving space for the entrance. The walls rose from below ground level to approximately 3 feet above the original hillside surface. This created both structural support for the earth pressing against the sides and raised walls that would support the roof. The stonework was meticulous. Gunnar fitted each rock carefully, using smaller stones as shims to prevent wobbling. He packed clay between the rocks, creating a matrix that would harden as it dried. The clay came from a deposit he had found a 1/4 mile away, dense blue clay that became almost cement-like when dry. He mixed the clay with water until it reached the consistency of thick mud, then worked it between the stones with his hands. The entrance required special attention. Gunnar erected 2 substantial pine logs as doorposts, sinking them 3 feet into the ground and bracing them with rocks and packed earth. The posts were each 10 inches in diameter, cut from straight trees he had felled specifically for this purpose. He notched a horizontal lintel log across the top, creating a door frame 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The frame tied into the stone walls on 22, both sides becoming an integrated part of the structure rather than a separate element. Above the entrance, he extended the stone walls upward another 2 feet, creating a facade that would support the front edge of the roof. The back wall needed no such construction because the hillside itself formed that boundary. The earth behind and beside the excavation was the wall, held in place by the stone retaining structures and the natural stability of undisturbed soil. Ventilation presented a challenge. Gunnar needed fresh air without creating a tunnel for heat to escape. He solved this by installing 2 ventilation shafts, one on each side of the shelter near the front. The shafts were made from hollow logs with the centers burned out, extending from inside the shelter through the roof structure to above ground level. He positioned them to look like old stumps from a distance, camouflaging their function. The roof structure would determine whether Gunnar's shelter succeeded or collapsed under its own weight. He began in early August by laying substantial ridge poles across the width of the excavation. These were not thin branches but carefully selected pine logs, each 8 inches in diameter and 14 feet long. He positioned them 18 inches apart, spanning from the stone front wall to the undisturbed earth at the back of the excavation. Each pole was notched where it met the stone wall, creating a stable seat that prevented lateral movement. The ridge poles rested partially on the stone walls and partially on the compacted earth at the rear, distributing their weight across multiple support points. Gunnar tested each pole by standing on it and jumping, ensuring it could handle dynamic stress. Any pole that showed flex or movement was rejected and replaced. The roof would bear hundreds of pounds of earth plus snow accumulation. Structural failure was not acceptable. Across the ridge poles, he laid split planks. These were pine boards he had spent 3 weeks creating using an axe and wedges, splitting logs along their grain, and then smoothing one surface with a draw knife. Each plank was roughly 6 inches wide and an inch thick. He laid them perpendicular to the ridge poles with minimal gaps between them, creating a solid platform. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles using wooden pins he had whittled during evening hours. Over the planks, he laid birch bark in overlapping layers. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, qualities that made it ideal for this application. Gunnar had harvested the bark in June when it peeled most easily from the trees. He had stored it flat under rocks to prevent curling. Now he laid sheets of bark across the entire roof surface, each sheet overlapping the one below it like shingles. The overlap pattern ensured water would flow downward and outward rather than finding gaps to leak through. The bark layer was insurance against the next component. Gunnar mixed clay with water and horsehair he had, traded for at the post. The horsehair reinforced the clay, preventing it from cracking as it dried. He spread this mixture over the birch bark in a layer approximately 2 inches thick, working it carefully to eliminate air pockets. The clay would create a waterproof seal and add thermal mass to the roof system. Over the clay, he added soil. Not random dirt, but a careful mixture of the subsoil he had excavated, mixed with compost and organic matter. This layer went on 18 inches deep across the entire roof surface. The weight was substantial, but the ridge poles and planking supported it without sagging. Finally came the critical finishing element. Gunnar transplanted sod blocks he had cut and saved from the original excavation. He laid living grass and roots across the entire roof, fitting the blocks together like puzzle pieces. Within weeks, the grass began growing, rooting into the soil layer below and creating a living roof indistinguishable from the surrounding hillside. Gunnar moved into his completed shelter on September 12, 1857. The interior measured 12 feet wide and 14 feet deep after accounting for the stone walls. The ceiling height varied from 6 feet near the entrance to 7 feet at the rear where the excavation was deepest. He had built a sleeping platform along the back wall, raised 2 feet off the dirt floor with storage space beneath. Shelves mounted to the stone side walls held his supplies, and in the front corner nearest the door, he constructed a small fireplace using flat stones. The fireplace was designed specifically for efficiency. Gunnar built it with a narrow firebox and a smoke shelf partway up the chimney that reflected heat back into the room while preventing downdrafts. The chimney extended through the roof in the front corner, disguised above ground to look like a natural rock formation. The entire fireplace required only a fraction of the wood a standard cabin stove would consume because the earth walls retained heat so effectively. The first serious cold arrived in late October. Outside temperatures dropped to 15 degrees above zero. Inside the shelter, without any fire burning, the temperature held at 48 degrees. Gunnar lit a small fire using 3 pieces of wood, and within an hour the interior warmed to 60 degrees. He let the fire die completely and monitored the temperature over the following 12 hours. It dropped only to 54 degrees. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth was absorbing heat and releasing it slowly, creating a stable environment that required minimal fuel to maintain. November brought the first heavy snow. 8 inches fell overnight. Gunnar went outside the next morning and could barely locate his own shelter. The sod roof had accumulated snow, but it was indistinguishable from the rest of the hillside. The entrance, recessed into the stone front wall, remained accessible but was invisible for more than 20 yards away. He realized the structure's camouflage was nearly perfect. Anyone passing within 50 feet would see a hillside, nothing more. Martin Graves visited in mid-November, curious to see the finished shelter. Gunnar watched from inside as Martin approached, observing how the older trapper walked past the entrance twice before finally spotting it. When Martin ducked through the doorway and straightened up inside, his expression showed genuine surprise. "It is warm in here," Martin said, removing his coat. Outside temperature was below freezing. Inside, it was comfortable enough that Gunnar wore only a shirt. "The earth holds heat," Gunnar explained. "I burn maybe 1/10 the wood I would use in a cabin." Martin examined the construction carefully, running his hands along the stone walls, studying the roof structure, testing the stability of the sleeping platform. He asked detailed questions about drainage, ventilation, and how Gunnar had waterproofed the roof layers. Finally, he sat at Gunnar's small table and spoke plainly. "Nathaniel and Ezra still think you are insane," Martin said, "but I think you have solved something important. This shelter will outlast any cabin in these mountains, and it will keep you alive in weather that would kill a man in standard construction. I want to build one next summer." Winter 1857 proceeded normally through December and into early January. Gunnar worked his trap lines, checked his beaver sets, and returned each evening to his earth shelter. The structure performed exactly as he had hoped. Interior temperature remained stable regardless of outside conditions. Snow accumulated on the living roof without causing any structural stress. The ventilation shafts provided fresh air without creating drafts. He used so little firewood that his supply, which would have lasted a normal cabin perhaps 6 weeks, stretched across 3 months. Martin Graves stopped by in late December with news that he had selected a site for his own earth shelter and would begin excavation in spring. The older trapper had spent the fall observing how Gunnar's structure handled weather and was convinced the design was superior to traditional construction. He asked if Gunnar would help with the building process. Gunnar agreed. In mid-January, the weather patterns changed. Gunnar noticed it first in the behavior of animals. Deer moved down from higher elevations earlier than normal. Ravens gathered in larger flocks. The few other trappers working the region mentioned similar observations. Martin visited on January 18th and shared a conversation he had with a Crow elder at the trading post. The old man had predicted a major storm, describing signs Gunnar had also noticed. Unusual cloud formations, strange wind patterns, temperatures that fluctuated more wildly than typical winter variation. He said it will be the worst in 20 years, Martin told Gunnar. Said it will come before February and last 3 days. Gunnar took the warning seriously. He checked his firewood supply and gathered additional wood, stacking it inside his shelter's entrance, where it would stay dry and accessible. He reinforced the door, adding an additional cross brace. He verified his food supplies were adequate for a week of being shelter-bound. Then he sought out the other trappers in the area. Nathaniel Pierce and Ezra Thornton had built a cabin 5 miles northeast of Gunnar's location. He found them there on January 22nd and shared the storm warning. He offered to help them reinforce their cabin or dig a secondary shelter into a nearby hillside. Nathaniel dismissed the concern. "We have survived 8 winters in these mountains," Nathaniel said. "Our cabin is solid. We are not going to spend a week digging a hole because some old Indian thinks bad weather is coming." Ezra was less dismissive but equally unwilling to change their approach. "If the storm comes, we will ride it out, same as always, but I appreciate the warning." Gunnar also found Joseph Weaver and Thomas Garrett, younger trappers working separate claims in the valley. Joseph's cabin was new, built the previous summer. Thomas had purchased an existing structure from a trapper who had left the mountains. Both men thanked Gunnar for the warning, but seemed unconcerned. Their cabins had survived the early winter. They saw no reason to doubt they would survive whatever came next. Martin began excavating his earth shelter on January 25th, working frantically to create at least a basic refuge before the predicted storm arrived. He completed the excavation and rudimentary stone walls, but had not finished the roof when the weather changed. The storm arrived on February 2nd, 1858, 3 hours after sunset. Gunnar was inside his shelter when the wind began. It started as a steady pressure from the northwest, then built rapidly into something far more violent. Within an hour, the wind was screaming across the landscape with force he had never experienced. Snow began falling so heavily that visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plunged to 20 below, then 30 below as the night progressed. Inside his earth shelter, Gunnar heard the wind as a distant roar, muffled by 8 feet of soil and stone. The structure did not shake or shudder. The door, recessed into the stone front wall and barred from inside, showed no sign of stress. His small fire burned steadily, the chimney design preventing any downdraft despite the violent wind outside. The temperature inside held at 55 degrees. He added 2 pieces of wood to the fire and settled onto his sleeping platform to wait. The storm continued through the entire next day without pause. Gunnar ventured to his door once at midday and opened it carefully. The wind nearly tore it from his hands. Snow had drifted across the entrance, and the world beyond was complete whiteout. He could not see 10 feet. He closed and barred the door again, grateful for the earth surrounding him. 5 miles northeast, Nathaniel Pierce and Ezra Thornton were not as fortunate. Their cabin began failing at dawn on February 3rd. The roof, covered with 2 feet of accumulated snow and subjected to wind that found every structural weakness, started separating from the walls. Notched corners that had seemed solid began shifting under the stress. By noon, the western wall was bowing inward. At 3 in the afternoon, a section of roof tore free completely. Wind and snow poured into the interior, extinguishing their fire and dropping the inside temperature toward lethal levels. They abandoned the cabin, taking what supplies they could carry, and attempted to reach another trapper's shelter 2 miles south. They made it half a mile before the cold and wind forced them to dig into a snowdrift and wait for the storm to pass. They survived by huddling together, but both suffered severe frostbite. Joseph Weaver's new cabin collapsed entirely during the second night. The ridgepole snapped under snow load, and the entire structure pancaked downward. Joseph was not inside when it happened. He had left hours earlier when the walls began separating, recognizing the building was failing. He wandered through the blizzard, searching desperately for any shelter, any structure that might save his life. Thomas Garrett's cabin lost its door during the second day when wind pressure and a shifted wall frame tore the hinges free. He barricaded the opening with his table and supply boxes, but snow infiltrated anyway. By the third day, the interior was uninhabitable. He abandoned the structure and began moving through waist-deep snow, hypothermic and disoriented, looking for anything that offered protection from the wind. Joseph Weaver had been walking for hours through the blizzard when he first passed over Gunnar's shelter without knowing it. The snow was waist-deep in places, deeper where drifts had formed. Visibility remained near 0 despite it being midday on February 4th. Joseph was moving purely on instinct, stumbling forward because stopping meant freezing to death. His hands and feet had lost feeling an hour earlier. His thinking was becoming confused, a dangerous sign he recognized but could not fight. He walked directly over the sod roof, which was buried under 3 feet of snow and indistinguishable from the surrounding hillside. He continued 20 yards past it, then turned and wandered back, crossing over the shelter a second time. On his third pass, he noticed something that stopped him. A thin ribbon of smoke rising from what appeared to be a rock formation. He stared at it, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant shelter. He moved toward the smoke and found himself standing in front of a hillside. No cabin, no structure, just snow-covered slope and rocks. He was beginning to think hypothermia was creating hallucinations when he noticed the entrance, a dark rectangular opening recessed into stone walls that were barely visible under accumulated snow. He stumbled toward it and pushed through the doorway. The warmth hit him immediately. After hours in 30 below temperatures, the 50-degree interior felt tropical. Gunnar was sitting at his table and stood quickly when Joseph fell through the door. He helped the younger man to the fire, removed his frozen outer clothing, and checked for frostbite. Joseph's fingers and toes were white and hard. Gunnar wrapped them carefully and got warm liquid into him, knowing the real danger would come when circulation returned. Thomas Garrett arrived 6 hours later, just before dark. He had been searching for any shelter and spotted Gunnar's chimney smoke from a distance. Unlike Joseph, he had enough awareness left to understand what he was seeing. An earth shelter, built into the hillside, invisible except for that single telltale sign. He crawled through the entrance and collapsed inside. Gunnar now had 2 men in various stages of hypothermia and frostbite in a shelter designed for 1 person. He tended them through the night while the storm continued to rage outside. The earth shelter's stable temperature and protection from wind made recovery possible. In a traditional cabin, even if the structure had survived, the temperature fluctuations and drafts would have made treating severe cold exposure far more difficult. The storm finally broke on the morning of February 5th. Gunnar opened his door to a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted to 6 and 7 feet in places. The sky was clear, brutally cold, and utterly still. His shelter remained completely camouflaged. The sod roof, now under heavy snow, looked like every other hillside. The stone entrance was the only visible indication that anything human-made existed here, and even that was subtle enough to miss from 50 feet away. Over the following 3 days, the full extent of the storm of 58's damage became clear. Martin Graves arrived at Gunnar's shelter on February 7th, having survived in his partially completed earth shelter. The excavation and stone walls had provided enough protection to keep him alive, though without a finished roof he had suffered through brutal conditions. Nathaniel Pierce and Ezra Thornton were found on February 8th by a group of trappers searching for survivors. Both men had severe frostbite and lost fingers to amputation performed at the trading post. Of the 11 trappers working the northern region that winter, 3 died. 2 were found frozen in the remains of collapsed cabins. 1 was never found, presumably lost in the storm. Every traditional cabin in the area suffered significant damage. Most were total losses. The few that remained standing had lost roofs, walls, or both. Only Gunnar's completed earth shelter and Martin's partial excavation had survived intact. The survivors gathered at the trading post in late February. Word spread quickly about Gunnar's shelter and how it had protected 3 men through conditions that had killed cabins and people across the entire region. Joseph Weaver described walking over the structure 3 times without seeing it, finding it only because of chimney smoke. Thomas Garrett confirmed the interior had remained warm and stable while the storm destroyed everything else. Nathaniel Pierce, recovering from frostbite with bandaged hands, sought out Gunnar specifically. "I called your shelter a grave," he said quietly. "I was wrong. It saved lives while my cabin nearly killed us. If you are willing to teach the technique, I want to learn it." Spring of 1858 saw a fundamental shift in construction methods across the northern Rockies. Gunnar spent April and May helping other trappers excavate and build earth shelters. Martin completed his structure with proper roof and waterproofing. Joseph and Thomas built shelters into adjacent hillsides. Even Ezra, despite his injuries, supervised construction of an earth lodge near his old cabin site. The technique spread through the trapping community organically. Men who had seen the storm's destruction and heard about Gunnar's shelter began building their own versions. The specific details varied based on available materials and individual skill, but the core principles remained consistent. Excavate into hillsides, build stone retaining walls, create proper drainage, construct roofs strong enough to bear earth, and cover everything with living sod. The shelters were warmer, more durable, and nearly invisible. By 1860, earth shelters or earth lodges were common throughout the region. Hunters, trappers, and early settlers recognized their advantages. The structures required more initial labor but lasted decades and provided protection that traditional cabins could not match. Gunnar himself left the mountains in 1862, moving to Montana Territory, where he established a small ranch. He married, raised a family, and lived quietly until his death in 1884. But the shelters remained, scattered across the Rockies, built into hillsides, and hidden beneath living roofs. Silent monuments to the day when innovation born from tragedy proved that sometimes survival meant working with nature rather than against it.